you like motorcycles, then Pickerington, Ohio is the place to be at the Motorcycle Hall of Fame Museum. When we were there, they were celebrating 100 years of the Indian motorcycle.
Hi, I'm Susie Reed with Vintage Vehicle Video, and we are here today at the Motorcycle Hall of Fame. Right here next to me is Mark Mazurski. Why don't you tell me a little bit about the Hall of Fame, what we're looking at right here?
Now, Susie, the Motorcycle Hall of Fame in Pickerington, Ohio is our location this morning. And the museum serves a couple of purposes. It studies and displays important motorcycles, but it also talks about the people that rode them, invented them, wrote about them. And right now we're in the Hall of Fame area, the lower level of the museum, and we're surrounded by motorcycles that were ridden by, invented by our Motorcycle Hall of Famers that are displayed on the wall behind us, about 285 of them. The machine that we're looking at right here is a land speed record machine, and the objective in land speed record is simply to go as fast as you can in a straight line. And Leo Payne used this machine to set a speed record of about 220 miles an hour in 1970 out at Bonneville. And before us is a Hillclimb machine, and again, it's a very purpose-built machine. If you can imagine a drag race that takes place up a dirt hill, probably less than an eighth of a mile, something that takes place in about 10 or 12 seconds. This is the kind of machine that they would use to do that. Susie, if you can imagine around the Civil War in America, there were no motor vehicles. There were no wagons powered by engines. There were no bicycles powered by engines. There was horsepower and people power. Well, about the mid-1860s in Europe and in America, they started experimenting with different ways to move a vehicle down the road without using animal power. And one of the machines is before us here. It's a steam-powered motorcycle, and it was built by a guy named Sylvester Roper. The French and some Americans started making steam-powered cycles in the 1860s, and Roper made one about 1867, about the same time the French were. So what we've got here is a kind of a typical steam engine. You need a firebox down low, could be fueled probably by coke or coal, and then you've got a water jacket up here, so the heat, the flame and such boils the water, makes steam, and down on the far side you can see a steam cylinder, and the steam goes into that cylinder with appropriate valving to time it and everything, and there's a connecting rod that takes the power right back to the rear wheel and makes it go down the road. Roper was experimenting with steam cycles for about 30 years. Unfortunately, this particular machine was his last. He was riding it in an exhibition in Massachusetts, I believe it was, in 1897 on a closed course, and crashed and was killed. But if you trace back, you've got some gasoline equipment by a guy named Gottlieb Daimler being developed in the 1880s, about 1885 in Germany. But this guy was working 20 years earlier on a steam-powered motorcycle. So as time goes on and I hear more about this, I like to tell people that, that Roper was really doing the work to make a motorcycle before Daimler was. One of my fascinations with the history of motorcycling is looking at people that had an idea that really changed things, made a real mark on the sport. And one of my favorites, since he's kind of a contemporary of mine, is a guy named Craig Vetter. And before us is some of Craig's work. These are called motorcycle fairings. And a fairing is simply a device that shields the rider from the weather, bugs, rain and wind and such. And Craig didn't invent motorcycle fairings, they go way back. But he developed what you might call a universal fairing that could be made to fit a wide variety of motorcycles just by changing some of the brackets. And Craig's 60 years old now, but he's very vital, and he's always thinking about the next idea. He likes to say that he preceded baby boomers and therefore was able to plan for their needs. And what he's working on right now, you won't believe this, a Harley-Davidson 1400cc V-twin powered scooter. And his objective here is to provide a conveyance that you can simply walk up to and step through and sit down on. It's not a conventional motorcycle where you have to throw your leg over. And he's anticipating all of us arthritic people in our 60s and 70s and needing to transition into something like this. So that's what Craig's about.
Great.
I've got Ed Youngblood in now. Ed, welcome.
Good morning, Mark.
Hi.
Ed's been with the American Motorcyclist Association since what, the 70s?
1970.
Okay.
Yes.
And he served as a president for about 20 years, and really in most people's opinion that know about the sport, brought the AMA to a whole new level.
You know, the 19th century was the era of steam when during the Industrial Revolution, and even the first motorcycles were steam-powered motorcycles. However, steam didn't work too well for small vehicles, and the real age of motorcycling kind of had to wait until toward the end of the century, when in 1885 Gottlieb Daimler invented a contraption very much like this in Germany. This was the first vehicle, the first personal vehicle in history powered by a gasoline engine. Daimler really had no intention of building a motorcycle. All he wanted was to create a test bed for his motors to see if they would work and if they were durable. And he built this device which, because the motor is in the center, the rider sits astride the motor, it has tiller steering similar to a modern motorcycle, single track vehicle. Although it had outriggers, it was so similar in design to a modern motorcycle that Gottlieb Daimler has been given credit for creating the first gasoline powered motorcycle in history. This is a replica. The original machine was destroyed in a fire in Daimler's shop. This replica was built by some craftsmen in Ohio who actually were working only from a photograph. They had no drawings and no plans, and it is really about 20% over scale from the original Daimler gasoline-powered motorcycle. This one actually runs, it'll go about 5 miles an hour, and it'll just about shake the fillings out of your teeth. Daimler, shortly after building this, formed Daimler-Benz, went on to a 3-wheel vehicle and then to a 4-wheel vehicle, and he never again built another 2-wheel vehicle. We can now go upstairs. I want to show you the rest of our exhibits, show you the Century of Indian exhibit and some of the other features of the museum. We enjoyed treating our visitors to a very rare and unusual Indian at the opening of the exhibit. First thing when you come into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame is you see a Indian toboggan sled that was created during the 1940s. It's not known how many of these were manufactured, but there weren't very many. It was tested for military use, but never really put into major production. To power the machine, you move this lever up and down, and it makes the whole big belt drive system move up and down. So that's how you regulate the pressure on the snow. And then to steer the machine, you simply move this lever forward or aft, and it moves the runners in the front of the sled. It has a kickstarter, just like a motorcycle. Fuel tank is here. And of course the exhaust is right here in front where it'll blow back on you when maybe that helps keep you warm in the snow, I don't know. The Toboggan features an Indian Scout engine with 3-speed transmission, and this one is a still working model. It's owned by the DuPont family in Delaware, and they tell me that they still on occasion take it out in the winter and enjoy themselves on their old Indian toboggan. The Indian motorcycle was a collaboration of 2 men, George Hindy and Oscar Hedstrom. George Hindy was an early bicycle champion rode the old high-wheeled bicycles, and by his own account, as a teenager, won 302 of the 309 races he entered. Had quite a remarkable racing career, and when he retired from racing, he naturally went into the bicycle business and created the Hindi Manufacturing Company in Springfield, Massachusetts, to manufacture bicycles. Along about the turn of the century, he had become convinced that the public was ready for a small personal vehicle that could be used to replace the horse. And he met and collaborated with a Swedish engineer from Brooklyn, New York, named Oscar Hedstrom. Oscar Hedstrom designed an engine that was very reliable, and Hindi commissioned Hedstrom to build a prototype motorcycle which Hindi hoped to manufacture. The result was a small vehicle like this, very much like an early bicycle, with a small engine mounted in the center, had less than 2 horsepower. It would go about 25 or 30 miles per hour, and was introduced in 1901. It worked so well that Hindi and Hedstrom went into mass production in 1902, and by 1910 or 11, Indian was the largest motorcycle manufacturer on earth. This example we have on display is a 1905. It is very similar to the first Indian, has some additional refinements to it. It has a front suspension. The first Indian had only a simple bicycle fork, no suspension, but it's very much like the first one. Indian, in its early years, was noted for its technical innovation, primarily as a result of the creativity of Oscar Hedstrom. Most motorcycles in this day had a leather belt drive to the rear wheel. Leather belt was smooth, it was easy to adjust, but it did not work well on hills, and it did not work well in wet weather. And one of the great innovations of the Indian was that the very first vehicle they produced in 1901 had a chain drive to the rear wheel. And Hindi helped prove his product by winning national reliability and marathon endurance runs aboard his early Indians. Indian became involved in racing from the very beginning. And of course, with racing, you need more power. Well, how do you get more power from one of these little motorcycles? Oscar Hedstrom simply added a second cylinder, banked it forward at 42 degrees from the single-cylinder engine. Hedstrom was experimenting with single cylinders as designs as early as 1905, and by 1908, Indian offered a production racing machine. Their customers could buy a machine ready to go to the racetrack. You'll notice that they moved the fuel tank from the back fender up to the center frame tube. This is called the Torpedo tank Indian because of the shape of the tank. And to get the rider crouched down out of the wind for better speed, they lowered the handlebars and they moved the seat way back. Very similar to sport bikes of our current day. People call this the monkey on a stick Indian because the way the rider looked when he was on the machine sitting way back on this seat. The Twin was very successful, not only for racing, but as a production motorcycle. And this is an example of a top-of-the-line 1914 Indian production Twin. This one has all of the accessories. It has a rear suspension, buddy seat, speedometer, clock, electric lights, horn. This is the Cadillac of the era. By this time, Indian was producing in the neighborhood of 30,000 motorcycles a year, and they were the biggest manufacturer on earth. Although Indian was the most successful manufacturer in the world by about 1910 or 11, at that time the company started to have problems, and it had problems for two reasons. One was Henry Ford and the popularity of the Model T, which was cutting into the whole motorcycle business. And the other problem was that manufacturers in the United States had started to build very inexpensive, low-cost machines. One of Indian's biggest thorns was this, the Flanders. The Flanders was manufactured in Detroit for only 4 years, but it was brought into the market at a very low price, and in 1912, Indian, for the first time in its history, reduced its prices to try to compete with motorcycles like the Flanders. The Flanders was a little single-cylinder machine, had a simple belt drive, no transmission, and was available very cheap. To try to compete with this kind of product, George Hindy and Indian created in about 1910 also a belt drive single. So technically, Indian, a company that had been noted for its innovation, went backwards and built a simpler, more primitive machine, no transmission, belt drive. This is a very rare example of a 1911, all original, unrestored, and it actually still runs. But it's an example of Indian trying to compete in a tougher market where Fords and cheaper motorcycles were beginning to affect its business. Perhaps the ultimate in Indian's early innovation was this motorcycle, the 1914 Hindy Special. This is the first motorcycle in history with an electric starter. You can see the big drum down here. This is the electric starter. Once the machine was moving and rolling down the highway, it converted from a starter to a generator and fed the electric lights and the engine. Unfortunately, although it was a brilliant design, it failed in the commercial market, not because the engineering was wrong, but because battery technology of the day simply wasn't up to the task. For the Hindy Special, they had to add additional batteries, bigger battery box, and unfortunately in day-to-day use they broke down and it simply would not work. These motorcycles today are extremely rare because almost all of them went back to the dealership, had the starter removed, and had it replaced with a conventional manual starter. So there are probably only 3 or 4 Hindy Specials left in the world that are still running and still have the electric starter. This model is also special because you'll note the blue paint. For 3 years, Indian had a manufacturing facility in Toronto, Canada. American-made Indians in Springfield, Massachusetts were red. Canadian Indians were painted in blue. And this not only is a rare Hindy Special electric start Indian, but it was manufactured in Canada and may be the only one in existence. One of the most famous names in American racing is Irwin Cannonball Baker, who was known for his transcontinental record runs from coast to coast on both cars and motorcycles. Baker started his career on this machine, which won the first race ever held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1909. Cars didn't run at the Speedway until in 1911, so the first 2 years it was all for motorcycles. At that time it was nothing more than a gravel and tar track out in a cornfield, and in 1909 Cannonball Baker won a 10-mile amateur national championship at the Speedway. This is the very machine he used. It's still owned by the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Baker went on to set several transcontinental records for Indian, and then later in his career moved to automobiles and did many records for American automobile brands. This is a very rare 1912 Indian 8-valve factory racer. Very few of these were built, and they had very modern technology with 4 valves per cylinder head. As you can see, it's on a banked board track. This type of machine was used for both dirt track and board track racing. Early motorcycle racing evolved from tracks that were built for bicycles, and they were called velodromes. They were rather small, about 1/3 of a mile, and they were actually banked this steeply. The motorcycles had no throttle, no brakes. They went full bore, and it was a very, very dangerous kind of racing. Board track racing continued into the 1920s when much larger tracks were built, up to 2 miles in length. And these types of motorcycles were used racing at speeds of 100 miles per hour. One of the worst tragedies in the history of American motorcycle racing took place with a machine very similar to this in New Jersey in 1912, when an Indian factory rider named Eddie Hasha crashed and killed himself, another rider, and 4 spectators. After that, most of the very small tracks were abandoned for motorcycle racing, and they confined their racing only to the larger circuits and to dirt tracks. During its early years, in the teens, Indian built a huge 5-story factory in Springfield, Massachusetts that they called the Wigwam. Unfortunately, as the market turned down in the 1920s, the board of directors had to start looking for other things to produce to try to keep the factory busy. One of Indian's acquisitions was the Indian Silver Arrow boat motor. Indian bought out the Hartford Outboard Motor Company in 1929 and went in to manufacture with its own branded outboard motor, which it tried to sell through motorcycle dealerships. Unfortunately, the timing could not have been worse. 1929, the stock market collapsed, and in 1930, the entire United States marine industry declined by over 30% in 1 year, and Indian found itself stuck with a product that it really couldn't sell. There are really quite a lot of these around because, as I say, they were not a success in the market because of the economy, and many of them ended up on dealers' floors and were never sold. One of Indian's more successful acquisitions was the Ace Motorcycle Company. Ace was founded by William Henderson, one of the great designers of 4-cylinder engines, in 1919. After his death, the company went into bankruptcy, and Indian acquired it in 1927. The Ace was a 4-cylinder machine, very smooth, easy to start, very powerful. In fact, it held several world speed records. Indian acquired this brand and the rights to build this machine in 1927. They brought it into their line as the Indian 4, and over the years updated the engine and redesigned the styling to make one of the great classic American motorcycles, the Indian 4. This gave Indian a product that Harley-Davidson had nothing similar to, and gave them a luxury, prestigious machine in their product line. As Indian's motorcycle market continued to decline in the teens, they remained convinced that they needed to build small, inexpensive products. One example in 1914 was the Model K Featherweight, a little 221cc two-stroke engine intended to be sold for use in cities at a low price. Unfortunately, it was not successful and was in the product line for only about 3 years. Consequently, the Featherweight is a very rare motorcycle today. When the Model K was unsuccessful, Indian replaced it with the Model O. This was a little 250cc 4-stroke engine, very unusual because it's a twin cylinder and the cylinders point forward and rearward. It was modeled after a British design built by Douglas. Again, though, it was no more popular than the Model K, and it was built in the product line for only about 3 years. So the Model O also is a very rare machine. Far more successful was the Indian Power Plus. This was the first major redesign of the Indian V-twin engine after Carl Hedstrom retired from the company. It was designed by an engineer named Charles Gustafson, and although it was originally designed for an engine that was easier, less expensive to manufacture than the Hedstrom twin, it turned out also to be more powerful than the Hedstrom twin, and was a very successful machine and became the basis for some of Indian's greatest racing motorcycles in the next decade. This example of the 1917 Power Plus is a very special one. It was used by John Goodman, who played Babe Ruth in the motion picture The Babe. So if you saw that movie, you may have seen this motorcycle in the film. At the outbreak of World War I, Indian built a military version of its Power Plus. Very similar to the street production machine, except you'll notice very flat fenders. They were built to be inexpensive to manufacture and functional in the mud in Europe, and over a 3-year period, Indian produced almost 60,000 of these machines, most of which went to Europe. They are very rare in the United States today because most did go overseas and were probably destroyed there. The Indian Power Plus evolved into the Indian Chief, an example of which is seen here, a 1,000cc machine built for use on the road. There are a number of other very interesting Indians in this exhibit. A 80 cubic inch hill climber, a 61 cubic inch hill climber used strictly for sport, and what many people consider the greatest Indian ever, the 101 Scout. An Irish engineer named Charles Franklin joined the Indian engineering staff in 1916, and Franklin was the creator of the Indian Scout, first as a 600cc motorcycle and then later 750cc's. It had a long wheelbase, a lower seat than most previous Indians, and it was noted for its good performance and good handling both on and off the road. The Scout, one of the Scout's competitors was the Excelsior Super X, which we put in the exhibit to show the similarity between the two machines. Both of these evolved into outstanding racing machines and were at the top of their class in the late 1920s. What did Indian and other motorcycle manufacturers do to try to compete with the Ford? Well, they offered sidecars. This is an example of a 1923 Indian Big Chief with the factory sidecar, and you could take the whole family along. Wife on the back and the kids in the sidecar, and you were all set. Some years during the 20s, half of Indian's production were sold with sidecars. So there was a period when they were very popular. This, incidentally, is probably the most popular exhibit in the Century of Indian exhibit because it's the only one where we let people touch the motorcycles. Visitors have been encouraged to climb aboard, get their photo taken, and we've had a lot of people do that. One of America's great industrialist families was the DuPont family in Delaware. E. Paul DuPont was always interested in things with motors, and this is a bicycle that he built, a motor bicycle that he built in 1903 when he was only a teenager. It was built from a kit, but he assembled it himself, and his father was so pleased with his son's effort that he bought him and his brother a new Indian. Now, surely at that time DuPont did not realize that someday he would own and run the Indian Manufacturing Company. In 1929, DuPont and his brother bought stock in Indian and acquired control of the company and introduced the era of the classic American Indians. E. Paul DuPont owned Indian from 1930 until 1945, and this was the era of the great classic Indians. It was the time when all of the American motor industry was developing streamlined styling, and the classic cars of the era like Cord and Auburn appeared. DuPont brought with him to the company a designer named Briggs Weaver, and Briggs Weaver did the motorcycle version of the classic streamlined vehicle. We've got in this exhibit examples, an original unrestored 1932 Standard Scout, 1936 Scout, 1939 Pony Scout, 1937 Indian Chief, and so on up to the Indian 4, one of the great classic motorcycles in America. DuPont contributed to the stylish reputation of Indian by offering the motorcycles in a vast array of colors that were available from the DuPont Automotive Paint Company. Good examples are this Scout and this Chief. You could have an Indian done in almost any two-tone style you wanted from the factory and could special order them in any colors available in the DuPont Automotive Catalog. Indian made its ultimate styling statement in 1940 when the full-skirted fender appeared. It appeared on all the models, the Scout, the Chief, and the Indian 4. This is the example of the 1940 Indian 4, one of the most luxurious motorcycles on the market. These are examples of two very, very different 1940 Indian Scouts. This is the 1940 Indian Sports Scout. Got the beautiful enclosed front fenders, all of the beautiful Indian styling. And this is the 640B, the Indian military scout built for the Second World War. As you can see, it's a real plain Jane next to the Sport Scout. Indian built 3 different models for military use during the war, and this was the first of the 3. During the 1930s, both Indian and Harley-Davidson did very good business building little service vehicles that were really nothing more than their motorcycle with a two-wheel drive on the back, a little 3-wheeled vehicle. Indian called theirs the traffic car, Harley-Davidson called theirs the service car, and they sold an awful lot of these that were used by local businesses. You could order the Indian built with any kind of custom designed body that you wanted for your business, and they are also very popular for police work. This is a totally original, unrestored example of the 1939 traffic car. It's the only one known to still exist with the complete enclosed van body on the back. Extremely rare, extremely valuable machine. The other feature that makes this one unusual is that the silver and blue livery are the official colors of the 1939 World's Fair. Indian offered vehicles painted in the official World's Fair colors, and this is one example of that type of vehicle. Indian set a world speed record with this machine at Daytona Beach in 1926. It has a very special custom-made engine with overhead valves, dual oil pumps, and Indian held that record for 11 years. Harley-Davidson came back and beat the Indian record in 1937, and Indian decided they needed to do something about that. They brought out the old 1926 racing machine, they refurbished it, and they built for it this streamlined shell. They took it to Bonneville, Salt Flats in Utah with the intention of setting records for both fully streamlined machines and unstreamlined machines. This shell separates in the middle, the nose cone bolts to the front of the motorcycle, the rider gets aboard, and then the back half of the shell is bolted on, just like 2 halves of an egg. This was before we had lightweight alloys and fiberglass, and the design is very much like early aircraft. The entire shell is built of aircraft grade spruce, and the covering is lacquered linen. The rider of the Indian era was Freddy Ludlow, and when they tried to enclose him in the machine, they discovered that he would not fit inside with his helmet on, and so he had to ride the record attempt with a leather cap instead of a helmet. In order to recapture the record from Harley-Davidson, Indian needed to go in excess of 136 miles per hour. Unfortunately, the Indian Aero, the streamlined motorcycle, went into a violent wobble at about 134 or 135. It was attempted several times. It always went out of control before reaching the record speed, and finally the attempt was abandoned. So this machine never set a world record, but that same week, Indian earned 2 world records with the unstreamlined machine. Because it was smooth and powerful and easy to start, the Indian 4 was very popular for police business. This is an original, unrestored example of an Indian 4 police motorcycle that originally was owned by the Marshall, Michigan Police Department. Incidentally, this machine still runs and is still ridden today by its owner in its original condition. Paul DuPont retired from Indian in 1945, and he sold the company to an investment group headed up by a very successful young 36-year-old industrialist named Ralph Rogers. Ralph Rogers brought to the company a totally new concept of what Indian should be. He believed America was ready for a lightweight motorcycle, easy to ride, easy to learn to ride. He wanted to sell to young people and to women, and until that time, motorcycling had largely been only for male customers. Rogers created what was called the Dynatorque Indians, modeled to a certain extent after what had become popular in British imports, such as this Triumph. They had foot shift, hand clutch, 3- and 4-speed transmissions, use of a lot of light alloy, twin and single-cylinder engines, very different from the previous Indians. They introduced a 220cc Indian Arrow, a 440cc Scout, a 500cc Warrior, and they also even had a 4-cylinder, a new Dynatorque 4-cylinder Indian on the drawing board that never went into production. Unfortunately, the company tried to build a new machine in a new factory. They rushed it into the market without adequate testing, and they were really a disaster. They broke down quickly. They ruined Indian's reputation, and the company in Springfield was out of business by 1953. Actually, by the time the Warriors appeared, the bugs were out and they were really very good machines, but the damage had already been done. Indian's reputation was spoiled, and it did not have the capital to try to recoup or resurrect better models, and they quit production in 1953. Indian and Harley-Davidson were great rivals on the racetrack, and these are examples of their racing machines. This is the Harley-Davidson WR. This is the Indian Sports Scout. This is a special sports scout called the Big Base Scout because it had a larger crankcase. It was introduced in 1948 and promptly won Daytona and continued to win races for Indian until 1953. These engines represent the era when the great rivalry between Indian and Harley-Davidson finally came to an end. Indian's chief engine dated back to the 1920s, and Harley-Davidson had a very similar engine. Now, in 1936, both companies, in the throes of the Depression, invested in major development plans. Harley-Davidson designed its new overhead valve engine that became known as the Knucklehead. It was called the Knucklehead because people thought that these big nuts on the valve rocker covers looked like 4 knuckles on a big fist. The Knucklehead was a spectacularly successful engine. At the same time, Indian in 1936 invested in a major redesign of its 4-cylinder, which did not prove out in the marketplace. Indian had to stick with its old chief engine. From there on, Harley-Davidson had a new high-performance overhead valve engine that it put into its machines. This is an extremely rare artifact. In the 1940s, Indian built an entirely new 4-cylinder engine with which they hoped to update their 4-cylinder motorcycle line. This was the X44 prototype. As far as anybody knows, only 2 of these were built, and one of them went into a motorcycle and was tested. 4-cylinder engine, 2 exhausts out each side, a very, very small, compact design compared to Indian's previous inline 4. Unfortunately, Indian didn't have the finances to put it into production. This is the very last of the great classic Indians. It's the 1953 Roadmaster Chief. Has the similar styling to the 1940 model, the big enclosed sweepy fenders, beautiful gas tank, instrument cluster on the tank. But in 1951, they updated it with telescopic front forks and dressed it up with additional accessories. The last models were built in '53. Only about 200 of these exist, and they are a very prized collectible because of that. They were the last product to come down the line at the factory in Springfield. When Indian was in deep financial trouble in 1949, they brought in a British investor named John Brockhouse. When Brockhouse got control of Indian, he bankrupted the manufacturing company, put it out of business, and stayed in business with its marketing firm, which controlled the dealer network. Brockhouse began to bring in British-made Royal Enfield motorcycles with the Indian brand on the tank. However, no one was fooled. Everyone knew they weren't really Indians. Indians fans didn't like them, and they were not very successful, and Brockhouse abandoned the effort entirely in 1961. Individuals in the motorcycle industry continued to battle over the Indian trademark for the next 40 years. Several machines were imported with the Indian name, and this is one example. In the late 1960s, this machine, which has a British engine, an Italian frame, with the Indian name, was imported. During the 1990s, there were some legal battles over the Indian name, and finally, a new American Indian company based in Gilroy, California, acquired the trademark in 1998. The company got rights to the name and trademark, and they are in production today, still building a new Indian. The classic 1940s Indian is still perhaps one of the most collectible, desirable motorcycles in the world today. Proof of that is the fact that a whole industry has sprung up to help people restore and resurrect the old 1940s Indians, even the Indian Chief engine. It is January 7, 2003, and the Century of Indian exhibit is no more. It is being dismantled today, and the next exhibit, Heroes of Harley-Davidson, will be installed soon. This is Cal Rayburn's Bonneville Streamliner, in which he set a world speed record of over 265 miles per hour in 1970. And it's one of the motorcycles that will be in the Heroes of Harley-Davidson exhibit. I want to thank you for coming to the Motorcycle Hall of Fame Museum to see a Century of Indian presented by Progressive Motorcycle Insurance. I hope you've enjoyed the tour. I hope you'll come back soon and see the next exhibit. They change all the time, and there's always something new and fresh. Thanks for coming.